Alright, so welcome back to another video. Okay, so in this video, we're going to go ahead and talk about a lot of topics with Next. I promise you it's not too much, but it is enough to at least help you understand all these concepts like server-side rendering, static site generation. Because when you first hear about Next, these are like the main buzzwords that people will throw around. And it might be very confusing because when you read the definition, it just says, well, server-side rendering, what exactly is it? It just renders on the server. But what does that mean? So don't worry, we're going to go ahead and dive deep into this topic. So we'll first start with talking about pre-rendering in Next.js. And keep in mind that these concepts are not explicit to React or Next. Many other frameworks like Angular, Vue, they have their own ways of supporting server-side rendering. So you can look into that. So pre-rendering, what exactly is pre-rendering? So by default, Next itself will pre-render every single page, okay? And all this means is that Next will just generate each HTML page ahead of time before sending it back to the client. So whenever the user makes a request to a page, Next will actually generate that HTML page upon the request ahead of time. Okay, so remember, Next.js runs on the server, and you're going to be building all of your components using React. You're going to be writing everything in JSX or TSX, and Next will take that React code. It's going to use that to generate the HTML and then send it back to the client. Okay, so remember, instead of sending the JavaScript bundle to the client and having the client generate it, Next will generate on the server and then send it back to the client, and for the client to serve it back to the user. Okay, and remember, this allows better load times for the user. So for example, if the user has a slow connection, it actually can benefit them a lot if you have server-side rendering. Okay, and this is also better for SEO as well. Okay, so I'll show you an example. So, well, not show you, but I'll give you an example. So with React projects that are built using Create React App out of the box, right? And I mentioned this already, but we'll talk about it again. So when you set up a Create React App project, by default, that app, when you run it, it actually contains a bundle, which is just JavaScript code. Okay, the browser must have JavaScript enabled, and assume that they do. That JavaScript bundle that is received on the client side, right, is going to be executed, and when that JavaScript code is executed, it generates all of the HTML on the client side, and then that is where the UI and all those things like the navigation bar, whatever it is that you're trying to render, that will be taken care of on the client side. Okay, in contrast with Next.js and pre-rendering, instead of doing that on the client side, we do that on the server side. Okay, so when we send a response back to the user, we're really just sending one HTML document or one whole HTML document. Okay, and then when that document is sent to the client side, it will load up in the browser, and then hydration kicks in, and then it will turn it from a static HTML document to a dynamic HTML document. Okay, so that's really what pre-rendering is. Okay, and I also listed out the steps of pre-rendering. So as I mentioned before, Next will generate all our pages. And remember, it's not specific to just React or Next, because you might have your own tools that you might want to use to generate your stuff on the server side. Okay, so it's not just specific to Next. Okay, but the whole process is similar, right? You generate all the HTML on the server side, you send it back to the user on the client side. It loads up on the browser, and then hydration kicks in, and it converts it from a static to a dynamic web document. Okay, so the goals of pre-rendering is just to have better performance, better SEO. If you use client-side rendering, right, you'll notice that, remember, if you go into a React project and if you actually, look at the actual elements, right, you're only going to see the root tag. Okay, if you disable JavaScript, you only see the root tag. You won't see anything in the head, you won't see anything else unless you enable JavaScript, and then everything will be generated on the client side with JavaScript. Okay, and that's bad because remember what we mentioned about with the Google web crawlers, it's going to slow down indexing and it's going to take forever. With server-side rendering, everything's already sent to the client, so it makes it easier for web crawlers to actually index your website. Okay. Now, there are two forms of pre-rendering in Next.js, and we're going to talk about them in this video. So the first form that we'll talk about is static site generation, and I'm really excited to talk about this topic with you all. So what exactly is static site generation? Well, we talked about client-sided rendering, and all that really was just generating all of the HTML on the client side. But with static site generation, we actually generate all of the HTML files during build time. Okay, not on the server, not during runtime, not on the client side. We actually generate during build time. So what exactly does this mean, build time? So let's say, for example, if you've used React before, and I'm assuming that you have done it before, when you deploy a React app, what you typically do is you run the build script, and that build script will take your entire React application and it'll bundle it into a bunch of static assets. So it'll bundle into JavaScript, CSS, HTML, right? And then you can take that build folder that it generates, all of the static assets. You can put it on some web server like DigitalOcean or Amazon EC2. You can spin up Apache web server or Nginx, and then you can let that web server serve those static assets. Okay, those static assets are sent from the web server to the client. The client performs client-side rendering, okay, assuming that the user has JavaScript enabled, and then the user can then use the application. But with static site generation, we don't generate the HTML whenever the user makes a request, which is what happens during server-side rendering. We don't generate it during whenever the client loads up. We generate when we run the build script. Okay, and that is the main difference between static site generation and server-side generation, or server-side rendering, as well as client-side rendering, is when we actually generate the HTML files. Okay, so with static site generation, what happens is when you run the build script with the Next CLI tool, right? What's going to happen is it's going to go ahead and generate all the HTML files, okay, dynamically. It's going to go ahead and generate all the HTML files based off of your React components. And if you're calling any external APIs, it will call those APIs, take the data that was returned from the API, and then just literally parse it into the HTML file that's being generated dynamically. Okay? And once all of those HTML pages have been generated during build time, right? You can just think of them as just like individual HTML files that are never going to change, okay, unless you run the build script again. Okay, so those HTML files are static and they can live on some server, and whenever a user visits a certain route or a certain page, it's going to go ahead and serve those static files back to that user. Okay, so it's generated once during build time, and then it's served to the user as many times as they want. So you can think of static site generation as kind of like caching, right? So there's no dynamic data whatsoever. So for example, if you perform static site generation and you're calling an API, right? Once you build that application for production, it's only going to call the API once. And if that API returns different data, let's say if it returns a different piece of information, your built static files are not going to actually receive that latest piece of information. You can think of it like it being cached. Okay, the only time that it will actually get the latest data is if you run the build script again. You can of course replace all those old files with the new files. It's the same exact thing when you actually are deploying the regular create React app, right? Because in order for you to actually get the latest changes, you need to run the build script again, and you need to replace all of the previous files with the new build files. Okay, so think of that as static site generation. Okay, you build it once, you can serve it as many times as you want to any user you want, and it's always going to be the same no matter what. Okay, so and of course all the stuff that I talked about just now is mentioned over here. So for example, any dynamic data that was fetched at build time, it will never update. You can think of it as just fetching the data once and then just injecting it into the HTML document, and it's just going to stay there forever. Okay. Now, with static site generation, it's really great when you have applications that don't need external data, or at least you don't need the latest version of it. So let's say, for example, if you're fetching, some data that will rarely ever change, right? Then static site generation is the way to go. Let's say, for example, if you're building, something like an API documentation, right? If you go to many library documentation, right, those things are rarely ever changed. Maybe in the beginning when the project is really new, but later on as time goes on, those things really don't need server-side rendering. It's better off to just use static site generation because they rarely will ever change. You can always just rebuild it whenever you're ready to publish, right? And even if it does change, right, it doesn't change as often as much as users will need to see the latest version of it, right? So you don't need to worry about changing stuff like that, for example. Okay. Blogs are also another good example too, and this really only makes sense if your blog does not update as much as you think it will. So let's say, for example, if you're just going to publish, a blog, and you're not going to make much updates to it, then this is a good way to use static site generation. The only time that you would need to rebuild the entire app again is when you're publishing a new blog. Portfolio websites are also a good example to use static site generation. So if you're building a website to showcase your skills, your projects, those things likely won't change rapidly. You can probably change them maybe once a month, once every 2 months. But the point is that they don't change within the next hour or so. So you don't really need to worry about server-side rendering. You can use static site generation. Okay. And also you can use static site generation for landing pages. Let's say if you're building a new product for, let's say if you're building, a website for a new product, like let's say some energy drink or a new bag of chips or whatever company you're building, right? You want to build a landing page for it. You can use static site generation, which is actually what Next recommends you to prefer, is to always prefer static site generation over server-side rendering because it's a lot more performant and faster. But there's not always a situation where you can prefer SSG over SSR. And I'm going to use the acronym SSG for static site generation and SSR for server-side rendering for the rest of this video just to save my breath. But yeah, there are some situations where you just cannot choose static site generation and you must choose server-side rendering. And we'll look at those examples as well. So a couple other examples in contrast on when static site generation is not great is, let's say if you're building an app that requires the latest data from some external source or your own database. So good examples of this would be if you're trying to build some kind of livestock application where you need the latest stock data, right? You probably don't want to use static site generation for that because your data is going to be changing constantly, like every minute, every second, it's going to be changing, right? If you have an application that has tons of state that can be changed over time from some side effect, such as calling an API, right? So if you're building a platform that, like an e-commerce platform, for example, right? Maybe you want to render the latest user transactions or the latest user payments. You can't really get away with using static site generation from that, right? Because when you make a post request, it's going to create a new resource on the server, and you're going to want the user to be able to see that latest transaction. Okay. Now I will mention that you can actually have what's called a hybrid app. So you don't necessarily need to have your whole app be all server-side rendering. You can actually have a mix of static site generation as well as server-side rendering. So for example, some parts of your application can just be static, right? And some parts can just be completely server-side rendered. Okay, and we'll talk more about that later. But another example would be if your application needs to perform many CRUD operations, many HTTP requests, or let's say if you're building a chat application using WebSockets, and you need to render the latest results on the UI for the user, definitely do not consider static site generation. Okay, So the one question that you should ask yourself always on when to pick SSG over SSR is if your app needs to display the most recent, recent data, right? Right? Can that be fetched once during build time, or does it need to be fetched every single time as soon as it's updated so the user gets a better experience? So that's the question that you should really be asking yourself. Okay. Another stuff too that you should ask yourself is, does my content change often? If my content does change, can it wait before it needs to be rebuilt and redeployed? Like, for example, if you're making changes to a blog, right? Maybe you saw a typo. You don't necessarily need to have server-side rendering for that. You can just republish it by just rebuilding the entire project again. Now, there are ways where you can have it automatically rebuild, but we're not going to talk about that right now. Okay, but again, that's just an example, right? If your content changes, can you wait a period of time before needing to rebuild the entire project, and then people will see the latest version of that? Okay, if your data, like, is my data dependent on an external source that updates often? So a good example of that, we mentioned already, stock APIs, cryptocurrency APIs, YouTube data API, right? If you're using the YouTube data API to fetch a YouTube channel's latest videos, that can also give back, that data can also be non-stale as well, right? So if the answer is yes to any of these questions, that is where you want to consider server-side rendering over static-side generation. Okay, now let's talk about server-side rendering now. Now that we have a better understanding of what static-side generation is and when to use it and when not to use it, let's go ahead into server-side rendering, and we actually will have a better understanding of it now that we understand what static-side generation is. So server-side rendering is literally when you have all of the HTML pages generated on the server that is served back to the client as a full HTML document, right? And the HTML document is loaded into the browser, and then it's hydrated to make the page fully interactive. Okay, now similar to static site generation, it's also part of the pre-rendering method. Okay, so all the HTML is also generated on the server side as well. Okay, and it's sent back to the user upon every single request. So with static site generation, everything is going to be generated, all the HTML is going to be generated during build time, and it's going to be generated once. With server-side rendering, it's going to generate the HTML pages upon every single request. So kind of like when you're fetching an API, and the API endpoint fetches the data from a database, right? It's going to always give you the latest data that's in the database, right? So with server-side rendering, the main difference between server-side rendering and static-site generation is just when it generates the HTML page. And you can also add in client-side rendering as well, right? To tie everything all together, client-side rendering renders everything on the client side, okay? Static-site generation renders everything during build time. Server-side rendering renders everything whenever it renders all the HTML whenever the request is being made by a user to the server. Okay, that's literally just the main thing that you need to understand between the differences between these three ways of rendering content. Okay, and that's really all it is. There's no need to make it more complicated. Well, let's go ahead and just look at some examples on when you would pick server-side rendering over static-side generation. So a good example would be when your application depends on the latest pieces of information or data. So if your data is always changing, let's say, for example, if you are building some kind of social media application and the user is always going to be updating their status, maybe you're building some kind of profile where you want the user to, you want to be able to see when the user last updated their status, right? These are examples of why you would pick server-side rendering, because remember, you're always going to need to fetch the latest piece of information. Okay, another example that I could give you is, let's say, for example, if we're interacting with the Discord API, let's say we're building a Discord bot dashboard, and we want to know, we need the user's latest guilds to be rendered on our page, right? Well, we know that users can leave Discord servers or they're also known as guilds, they can leave them at any time, and they can also join new servers at any time. So if we were to use static site generation for this, it would only give us the current data, and if the user left, we wouldn't get that. We wouldn't have the latest data. That data would pretty much be stale, and we would only get the latest data until we rebuilt the entire project again. Then it would generate everything in static HTML. Okay, so with server-side rendering, however, we would make a request to the external source every single time, and then we would render that. We would render everything on the server and then send it back to the user. Okay, so for an application like this, you definitely want to use server-side rendering because you need the latest piece of information. You have content that's going to be changing all the time, whenever. Okay. So other things to note about server-side rendering is that it's very good for end users that have very slow connections, and that could also that can also be in the context of, let's say, if your server is located across the world. Let's say, for example, if I'm in the United States and my server is based in the United States and I have customers from, let's say, Europe or Japan, for example, they might have like a slower connection. So having server-side rendering could be a lot better, because instead of just sending all of the JavaScript bundles to the client side and having the client side take care of all the generation, you can just send one whole document with minimal JavaScript and just have it load up faster for the user. Okay? So let's just quickly talk about client-side rendering. I know we talked about it briefly in the previous videos, but I just want to cover it because we kind of loosely define the term. But with client-side rendering, again, all it really is the JavaScript is loaded on the browser. Okay, it's served from some web server, and then that JavaScript is executed on the browser, and it generates all of the HTML, and then it's just rendered on the UI. That's really all it is. Okay. So now that we have a better understanding between all three of these rendering techniques, which one is better? Now, this, of course, just really depends on the use case. You're going to find people who will prioritize static site generation over server-side rendering, and the other way around. And we looked at examples of that, right? We looked at examples of when you'd want to pick static site generation over server-side rendering. And those examples included API documentations, code snippets, blogs for static site generation. And for server-side rendering, that included interacting with external APIs that is always going to update constantly. The data, it's always going to update constantly. Working with any API, really, that's just going to update constantly, even if it's our own systems, right? And if we know our systems are going to update all the time, it's better to use server-side rendering so we can serve the latest information to the user. Okay? So, now, one thing that I should also mention is that client-side rendering, some of you might just immediately think that it's bad, but it's actually not bad at all. It just depends on your use case, right? There's no such thing as a technique or a language or a framework being bad per se. It just needs to fit the use case. So, for example, even though with client-side rendering, it might be a little bit slower, it might be not as good when it comes to SEO performance, right? However, it is good in situations where you need to just generate the HTML once on the client side, and you no longer need to make any more requests to fetch any additional scripts or HTML for the user to just serve on the browser, right? So you can just literally just fetch all of the JavaScript bundle from the web application. From the web server like Nginx, right? And then all that will be generated on the browser, and then the user can actually interact with the application without needing to make any more requests. So this is actually beneficial if you want to build applications that can run, without like an actual existing connection. So apps that work in offline mode are a good reason to use something like client-side rendering. Okay, but of course, like I said, every technique has its own use case, and that's why we are going to dive into creating a Next.js project, and we're going to go ahead and look at how we can set up static site generation, server-side rendering with Next.js. Okay, I'm going to show you all the concepts, of course, and then you'll better understand what exactly Next is. Okay, so first off, thank you for watching this whole video. I know we talked about a lot of stuff, but again, I think it's very important to mention these things because without understanding these concepts, it's going to be very hard to understand what exactly Next is. Okay, but again, we're going to go ahead and dive into the framework for Next.js. We're going to start from scratch. We're going to cover everything from pages, components, routing, dynamic paths in Next. Then we'll look at static site generation, client-side rendering. We'll work with databases. We'll connect our application to an Express API, and we'll do a whole bunch of stuff with Next.js. So thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next episode where we will actually get started with setting up our next project. Peace.